all right, everyone, welcome. So sorry about the postponement last week. It would have been an adventure if we'd had the class, because I had about, I would guess 25% brain power, and I'd have been all over the place and probably wouldn't have made any sense. So I appreciate your patience with us. So what we're going to do, we're not going to adjust the schedule at all. And what I mean by that is we have 7 more sessions after tonight. What I'm going to do is combine next to last week, the questions of why are Christians so judgmental, why are Christians hypocritical. There's some overlap there. So I'm going to combine those. So I long ago figured out I don't need to make the mistake of taking a class or series into Memorial Day. So we will be done the Monday before Memorial Day, okay? I think, and some of you have emailed me about fill in the blanks. I think it's going to be a lot better today for you. We have slides, so you'll be able to follow along, and I think it'll be awesome. If we have any time left, we'll take questions. I do have a hard out at 7, so I guarantee we'll be done by 7 tonight. All right? I did want to tell you as well, I checked, the first session is on our platforms now, Right Now Media and YouTube. If you have the Northside app, you go to it and scroll all the way down, and you'll see Right Now Media, and you click on that. And then, at least on my phone, up in the left, it has a Northside icon. You click on that, and then it pulls up the Answering Our Questions. It also has the How to Study the Bible class that we did last year. On desktops, it's a little different, but it's easier to navigate for me on a desktop than it is on a phone. So I think it'll be more self-explanatory on the desktop. If you have any problems, just let us know. If you want to go back and watch previous classes, and you'll be able to, I think that's going to be a great resource for you. You also, of course, can point people to it in your life or in the future. If you know, hey, somebody really, this would be a great topic for them, then you can point them to that. Okay? So I think that's all the preliminaries. I'm going to pray for us and get going. Thank you, Father, for your love for us and the minds that you give us, the word that you give us, and how we can see your fingerprints over everything when we look. But we all have people in our life that sometimes are resistant to your teaching or your truth and have very real doubts, questions that they wrestle with. And particularly this one today, I just pray, Father, you'd give us insight, you'd give us grace as we think about it, also as we then talk about it with others, that we might be great witnesses for you. Is my prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. All righty. So what are we talking about today? Are science and Christianity compatible? Are science and Christianity compatible? You know, it's often, I think, set up as if you have to choose one or the other. The way some people would say it is, you know, did the rise of science put God out of a job? And I would say the hard answer to that is an N to the O. But we do want to have, I think, ways to answer that question, and that's what we're going to do. And really, one of the battlegrounds is often in the concept of evolution. And so we're going to talk a lot about that tonight, and then hopefully get you where you feel like you can talk more about that. So I want to define some key terms first. First, microevolution. Microevolution is the belief that small-scale, rapid genetic changes within a population or species occur. And I will say to you, I think there's almost universal agreement between people who are agnostic or atheist and Christians that you can see evidence of intraspecies evolution. But what do I mean by that? Well, some examples are antibiotic resistance. You see that happen Maybe you've had that happen in your life. You've been treated too often with antibiotics, and they stop. The diseases become resistant to the same effects. That's evolution. It's microevolution. How about dog breeds, right? There's a lot of funny dog breeds, and then they get out and get together, and mutts are born, and they develop and have all kinds of funny looks to them. We had a little dog one time. He was so funny looking. He was like, you could tell he had some golden retriever in him, but he also must have had some either corgi or beagle in him. And so he had this golden retriever body with short little legs. I'm not sure how good he had done getting the ducks out of the pond, but you can see that, and that happens. I think it's a feature of God's design and God's creation that He makes us able, bodies in different species, be able to make adaptations to better be able to navigate life, to live in life. There's no question. You look at the biological data of human beings in America over the last 200 years, they have gotten taller. They have gotten, let's say, more volume. There's been that evolution, and it's a combination perhaps of nutrition, but I also think it's just adaptation to the times. Bird beak changes. This is the big one that Charles Darwin observed, how different birds, the shape of their beaks, the function of their beaks would adapt over time to be able to better feed themselves, take care of themselves. Microevolution, I think, is clear, at least to me, that God has wired us with that mechanism to, not just us humans, but also other species, to be able to adapt to whatever we got going on around us. What we typically think of when we talk about evolution is what's called macroevolution. This was popularized by Charles Darwin in his famous book, The Origin of Species. What this refers to is large-scale, long-term changes, evolutionary changes that transcend species. In other words, some species evolves into another species. And of course, he has the tree of life, which has lots of holes in it. That's not a pun. I mean, that theory has lots of weak branches. But I'm not going to talk about that specifically tonight. I'm just saying that's kind of the water carrier for macroevolution. It transcends species boundaries. In other words, you have the creation of new species out of a totally different species. And so, of course, he posited that, especially with the humans, that we evolved from primates, monkeys, and into primates, and then into human beings. And that is often the battleground. It's the macroevolution, not the microevolution. So I'm not going to talk much more about microevolution. I just want you to be clear when you're talking with folks that sometimes people are actually talking about microevolution issues and thinking they somehow contradict the creation by God that we read about in Scripture. And I don't think that's true. I don't think macroevolution, I think it has a lot more, it's a lot less compatible with Christianity and the Christianity thought behind creation. But a really important definition I want to give you, because I really think people talk about evolution, but I really think the central issue is what's called philosophical naturalism. And what that refers to is, in the scientific community, there's been pressure, there's been a kind of a peer pressure to only accept natural reasons or causes for phenomena that's observed. To totally rule out any kind of supernatural explanation, any kind of supernatural factors when you're talking about something. And this philosophy is what is really made, I think, the more of a battle between science and Christianity. And so what is remarkable about this is this philosophy operates regardless of the topic or the strength of the evidence for Christianity, for different aspects of science that could very much have a supernatural cause or supernatural explanation for why they are. And in fact, I'll show you, even in the explanations that oftentimes they talk about in terms of evolution, even in those explanations, sometimes there's no other reasonable explanation except a supernatural cause or explanation. And I want to say to you, this is not new to God. Way back in Romans chapter 1, I don't have these verses up here, so you just need to make a note in your margin. Romans 1, 18 to around 23. I'm going to read it to you. And it really kind of explains what's going on, how there's always going to be this propensity of man to try to exclude God from our lives, i.e. are controlling us. And we've seen this from the beginning of time. What was the original motive that the serpent gave to Adam and Eve to eat of the tree of the fruit of good and evil? It was, you can be like God, and you have this fruit. But Romans 1:18 says, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godliness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Listen to this, verse 19. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. This really could be a kind of a theme verse for this whole lesson, in that I think if you're looking to exclude God because of your pride, because of human wickedness, making a rationale for our wickedness, our selfishness, our self-centeredness, our self-destructiveness, you can do that. But there is plenty of evidence for God being fully involved in the creative process. And he goes on, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man and birds and animals, reptiles. With that background, I want to tell you how I approach any discussion with someone that's very much a believer in evolution, very much a person of science. And I will just let you in on my conclusion from the get-go. I don't believe science and Christianity are incompatible. I think you can be a Christian and a scientist, a believer in science, and we'll talk more about that. But I just want to make that clear from the start. But Darwin himself, there were major building blocks of his theory of macroevolution that he doesn't address or explain. And I think he cannot have a cohesive theory of creation, of evolution, without addressing these three building blocks. And so we're going to specifically and mostly talk about these three building blocks, because if you're having a conversation with someone that's arguing for evolution, arguing against Christianity, I think this is really where you need to go. I don't think you need to go to Darwin and all that stuff. I think you have to, if you can't answer these questions, then it makes it really hard to elevate evolution over biblical creation. So, what are these building blocks? Matter matters. Boy, that's profound, isn't it? Matter matters. What do I mean by that? Well, let me tell you a joke. It's a dad joke, but it's a joke nonetheless. One day, a group of scientists got together and decided that humankind had come a long way and no longer needed God. So they picked one scientist to go and tell him that they were done with him. The scientist walked up to God and said, God, we've decided that we no longer need you. We're to the point where we can clone people and do many miraculous things, so why don't you go on and mind your own business? God listened very patiently to the man. After the scientist was done talking, God said, very well, how about this? Let's say we have a people-making contest. To which the scientist replied, okay, we can handle that. But God added, we're going to do it just the way I did back in the old days with Adam. And the scientist said, sure, no problem. And he bent down and grabbed himself a handful of dirt. And God looked at him and said, no, you got to go get your own dirt. Matter matters. Carl Sagan, who's an agnostic, he once conceded, if you wish to make an apple pie from scratch, you have to first invent the universe. Think about that for a moment. Evolution could have never gotten off the ground without the original necessary ingredients present and accounted for. To say this happened on its own is a huge, I can't emphasize how huge, leap. God had all of this raw stuff, and this raw stuff had to come from somewhere. Where did the vast amount of the raw stuff come from in the first place? I will say maybe every week of this class, when you're talking with people who believe differently, my advice to you is to be an expert question asker, to ask really good questions. And this is a great question to ask someone that is all about evolution. Where did the raw stuff come from? Where did it originate from? Now, some want to talk about the Big Bang. And it's possible to name an event, call it the Big Bang or whatever, but oftentimes scientific folks, well-meaning, but they talk about the Big Bang without explaining it or why it happened. They describe something that was metaphysical as well as a physical event. They put a scientific label on it, and then they claim to know that this astounding turn of events happened in the complete absence of any outside mind or creative designer. How did they know that? Simply put, they just don't. They've ruled God out of the equation by definition, saying what we were talking about earlier, because they're philosophical naturalists, that God couldn't have been part of that. And they have, I thought I had this set on silent. I apologize. I always have it set on, so I don't know what happened. Anyway, they have ruled God out of the equation, and now they don't want to even consider, but they don't have a good answer for where the original raw stuff, the original matter came from. And we see this, that erroneously sometimes we think that the vast majority of scientists are not believers, but that is not true. According to a book called Science versus Religion, What Scientists Really Think, written by Elaine Howard Eklund, she said she surveyed nearly 1,700 scientists and interviewed 275 of them. She found that most of what we believe about the faith lives of elite scientists is wrong. Nearly 50% of them are religious. Further, John Polkinghorne, who's a former professor of mathematical physics, he insists that science and religion are friends and not foes in the common quest for knowledge. We want to make sure and understand. I think sometimes we think there's so much disagreement, but it is clear that you have to start with this original building block of where did the first matter come from. And so then we hearken back to our first class. If you were here, if you can go back and watch it, check your notes. When I gave you this cosmological argument, whatever begins to exist must have a cause for its existence. Number two, the universe began to exist. Number three, therefore the universe must have a cause for its existence. It couldn't start itself. It couldn't create itself. Number 4, the attributes of the cause of the universe being timeless, existing outside of space, and so on are the attributes of God. Therefore, it's very logical, and I think the best conclusion that the cause of the universe must be God. So we see this, and I hope it strengthens you in understanding and thinking about this first block, matter matters. The second block is the origin of the original species. How did the first life begin? Darwin starts with his theory of things evolve, species to species, organism to organism, but he doesn't even have a guess at where that first life came from. And there have been all kinds of weak attempts made by scientists through the years, like that it all just randomly happened. All of a sudden life happened. They've had other discredited theories that no one believes, even to the point where there's been a serious attempt by some scientists to devote themselves and explain the first life by this theory they call panspermia. Maybe the only time in your life you ever hear the term panspermia. Panspermia means that life was planted here. It originally was started here by aliens from outer space. And I'm saying they make academic long papers about this stuff. Why? Because most evolutionists today, they don't even have a serious guess about how life began on the planet. Biochemist Klaus Doss concludes more than 30 years of experimentation on the origin of life in the fields of chemical and molecular evolution have led to a better perception of the immensity of the problem of the origin of life on Earth rather than to its solution. Lots of thoughts about the problem, no real solution. At present, all discussions on principal theories and experiments in the field either end in stalemate or in a confession of ignorance. So we think through that. We think it's a really serious problem with being a believer in evolution if you have no plausible, good explanation of how life exactly started. The reality is it's amazingly complex and never could have happened randomly. Life, it had to come from an intelligent design is the only thing that makes sense. The fossil record Darwinian followers talk about, it makes more proof for supernatural explanation than it does for some kind of Big Bang theory or that kind of thing. The fossil record shows early life just showing up, bam, unannounced and fully formed. So not only did Darwin fail to explain how life got here in the first place, the life that got here first did so in ways that didn't fit his theory. It's almost as if a creative designer had just made and placed these life forms here supernaturally. How about that? Cambridge Change philosopher of science Stephen Mayer elaborates. He says, and I know this is detailed. You see why I couldn't do this with 25% brain power last week? But he writes this: consider what you need for a protein molecule to form by chance. First, you need the right bonds between the amino acids. Second, amino acids come in right-handed and left-handed versions, and you've got to get only left-handed ones. Third, the amino acids must link up in a specified sequence like letters in a sentence. Run the odds of these things falling into place on their own, and you find the probabilities of forming a rather short functional protein at random would be 1 chance in 100,000 trillion. Forget that. That's 10 with 125 zeros after it. And that would be only one protein molecule. A minimally complex cell would need between 300 and 500 protein molecules. His conclusion, to suggest chance against these odds is really to invoke a naturalistic miracle, or there has to be a supernatural intelligent designer. So if life didn't happen on its own, there had to be that first life come from created matter somewhere else. Then why would that not be God? I don't believe it's inconsistent to say there's a big bang, but I think it was a big bang initiated by God at a certain point in which he began to create everything, as he tells us. The third building block, the origin of information. In other words, how do we explain the specified complexity of DNA in one cell? Mike has done a lot of research on this. He was talking to me about it after the class last week. The key feature of life is really information, intelligence, processing of data, specified complexity. Even the most simple bacterial cells teem with vast amounts of information. A single primitive cell would require hundreds of thousands of bits of information precisely sequenced in its DNA. How complex are we talking about today? We're talking about that there is no evidence of simpler life forms from which bacteria could have evolved. Because of that, evolutionary biologists are left with a mystery. Here's the key question. How can nature, without intelligent guidance, take the massive informational jumps needed for life to originate, to put all of this into the DNA in each individual cell to make sense, to come together? These hurdles cannot be cleared. They simply cannot be cleared without information. It's why a growing number of scientists today are turning to intelligent design as the best explanation for the origin of life. Francis Collins is a name maybe you know because he was in the news about 20 years ago. He led the Human Genome Project, which they mapped out the entire DNA sequence of the human species. Collins describes the information contained in our DNA like this, and listen carefully because this will blow your mind. He said this newly revealed text was 3 billion letters long and written in a strange and cryptographic 4-letter code. Such is the amazing complexity of the information carried within each cell of the human body that a live reading of that code at a rate of 3 letters per second, talking pretty fast, would take 31 years, even if reading continued day and night. Printing these letters out in regular font size on normal bond paper and binding them all together would result in a tower the height of the Washington Monument. For the first time, Collins writes, on that summer morning, this amazing script carrying with it all the instructions for building a human being was available to the world. The DNA info encoded into every human cell is astounding. It is simply astonishing. It is so breathtaking that Collins aptly named his book about it, The Language of God. Yes, Francis Collins is a strong Christian. A title that echoes the words that President Bill Clinton used when he stood next to Collins and announced that the amazing Genome Project had been completed. This is an exact quote. He said, "We are learning the language in which God created life." Science and Christianity are not incompatible. The best explanation for these building blocks is God. That is a great starting point for you to ask really good questions when you have this kind of conversation with someone. You want to understand and get this bottom line. Darwinian evolution, if true at all, and I think, I really do, I'm not just saying this to be funny or wry, I think it takes more faith to believe in Darwinian evolution than it does to believe in Christianity and God's creation of everything. But if it's true at all, it relies on at least these 3 factors that need God as their logical explanation. See, this is why you start here with these building blocks. instead of getting into all the nuts and bolts of Darwinian evolution. Because if you can't explain, you can't come up with a realistic explanation for these building blocks, then the whole theory of evolution falls apart. Now, having said that, I want you to hear me clearly. I think the focus of our conversations with scientific skeptics, I think they should not primarily be Darwin's theory, but with countering philosophical naturalism. In other words, you start with, and as you interact in conversation with someone that's very heavily influenced by evolution, you'd start with that possibility that there can be both natural and supernatural explanations and causes for the things we observe in science. You do not have to, it's an artificial construct to relegate those discussions just to natural explanations or causes. I think you want to attack or counter philosophical naturalism instead of making the conversation all about evolution. You want to turn it to the fact that so much of what is positive is the scientific view of the evolution of species. It comes from a place that can only be explained supernaturally. Those building blocks only, I think, can have a supernatural explanation. And so I want to say something very important to you. I want you to remember when you're talking to someone, I want you to remember the heart behind what you're doing. As you're talking to someone who believes differently than you, or maybe even you wrestle with these doubts yourself. The goal is converting people to Christ. It's not to a specific view of creationism. And unfortunately, that's what a lot of us Christians default to. We default to trying to make someone a creationist before we talk to them about their need for Christ, their need for surrender, their need for humility and forgiveness. They're the evidence for God and Christ in the Bible. I don't know that we convert a lot of people if we're going to argue with them nonstop about different scientific topics. I want to share with you this quote from the evangelical philosopher William Lane Craig to get into this last issue. And I almost hesitate to get into the last thing I want to talk to you about because I think maybe you'll start going that route and thinking this is how you have to sort everything out and everybody's got to agree with you on this other thing. But this is what he said. Now, what about the question of evolution? Let me submit to you that, to me, this is complete red herring. It's what William Lane Craig said. The theory of evolution is irrelevant to the truth of the Christian faith. Genesis 1 permits all matters of interpretation and a manner of interpretations, and Christians are not necessarily committed to special creationism. And I want to emphasize that this is not a retreat caused by modern science. St. Augustine, in the 300s, in his commentary on Genesis, argued that the days needn't be taken literally, nor need the creation be a few thousand years ago. He didn't even envision special acts of creation. He said that the world could have been made by God with certain potencies that unfolded in the progress of time. And this interpretation was enunciated 1,500 years ago prior to Darwin. And therefore, it's a position that is consistent with being a Christian. He goes on, any doubts that I might have about the theory of evolution really are not biblical, but scientific. Namely, what the scenario envisages is just fantastically improbable. In their book, The Anthropologic Cosmological Principle, Barrow and Tipler laid out 10 steps necessary to the course of human evolution, each of which is so improbable that before it would occur, the sun would have ceased to be a main sequence star and would have burned up the earth. Now, it seems to me that if evolution did occur, then it would have had to have been a miracle. In other words, any evolution is literal evidence for the existence of God. So what am I talking about with creation? Maybe these are things you've heard about, and you're going to have a view, I think, if you study this. There are 3 different views of creation that are often made test to fellowship. I think that's a mistake. to talk about that and think about that, we need to think about what's called first order theology, second order theology. First order theology are the absolute essentials that we have to agree on, like the Trinity, like the deity of Jesus, the divinity of Jesus. Those are things we cannot have fellowship and disagree on. The way the founders of our theological heritage, the Restoration Movement, the way they would say it is, in essentials, we need unity. In opinions, we can have diversity. And in all things, love. First order theological discussions, there has to be agreement on. You can't believe and be a Christian that Christ was not really divine. There are second order theological questions. These are more areas of, they're important, they're good to talk about and study, but it is not necessary to have agreement on them to still have fellowship, to still be brothers and sisters. Some of these are examples might be the way the church is organized, the ecclesiastical structure. It might be what people wear to church. It might be some of the dominational positions that people have taken that that you don't have to have full agreement on. You maybe aren't in the same type of church, little C church, but you still can be brothers and sisters. And so the question is, and I obviously have an opinion, is the view of creation, God's creation that you hold to, is it something you should make a hill to die on? Is it something that absolutely has to be a first order matter of theology? And I would argue that it is a second order matter of theology. I am not crazy about any of the three I'm going to give you. I wish I could mold them all together. But you can study and think about it yourselves. And I'm glad to, if I don't have time tonight, I can talk to you more about it. If you want to talk about different ones of these views, but I at least wanted to lay them out for you because you probably have heard them. And if you maybe have a discussion with evolutionists, they may bring up one or more of these, okay? The first view is that the earth is young, that the earth is less than literally 10,000 years old. And it was created with literal 24-hour days of creation. And there are Christians that legitimately believe this, and I'm okay with that. I can understand that. I can even make a case for it. That's one view. A second view is that the earth is a lot older than that. That it's at least millions of years old, if not billions of years old. And the days of creation talked about in Genesis are, they're referring to eras or ages. That this could have happened over lots and lots of time. And God intervened through those ages to supernaturally and specifically create life. That's a very important point. He intervened to supernaturally and specifically create species, create humans. It wasn't something that just kind of evolved and happened, even though they posit, a person in this view, that it took a lot longer, that this is spread out much longer over time. So, for example, the first day when God created the heavens and the earth, that could have been spanning billions of years. So there's not as rigid an explanation or adherence to 24-hour days measured time. The third view is what's called theistic evolution. This view holds that God worked actively, but behind the scenes, to bring about life as we know it, as we see it today. In this view, the days are largely allegorical. This is really kind of God put the processes in place, and he set it in motion, and then it all kind of came about and happened. And you know, like I say, there are strengths and weaknesses of each point of view. Personally, this is the weakest of the points of view, but you do your own study. But what I want to say again clearly is I don't want you to think you have to convince everybody either in fellowship and as other Christians or people who aren't Christians yet. I don't want you to feel like you have to convince them to your preferred point of view in the creation explanation. The important point is that God intelligently, specifically, mysteriously, and magnificently, he created everything that we see just like he planned it. And he made us in his image. He made us to have fellowship with him. He wants our very best life. Our sin gets in the way. As we deal with that sin by confessing it or repenting of it and coming to him in Jesus' name, that he forgives us, that he brings us back into fellowship with him. That is the most important thing. So I want to give you some tips for discussion as you're talking to people that have a much more scientific bias, a much more evolutionary bias. I want you to listen to the nuance of the evolutionary questioner. And I want you to understand, I know this because my son Bo, he taught biology at Warrensburg High School for quite a few years. I know the curriculum that is often chosen to be passed down has a very strong Darwinian evolutionary bent, that supernatural means, if they're not discredited, they're minimized. And I know that we have students as a product of those educational environments that are predisposed to argue for evolution, even if they don't really understand it, even if they've really never studied it or thought about some of the things we've talked about tonight. Some of them have never thought about matter matters. Some of them have never thought about where did the original life come from. Some of them have never thought about the origin of information, how amazingly complex and intelligently designed each human cell's DNA is. They've never heard it. So you want to listen to their talk, to their understanding of evolution, of maybe their questions about Christianity. Oh, sorry, that one didn't come up. I see it up there, but y'all couldn't see it for you to fill in the blank. Well, actually, I was nice to you. I didn't give you any blanks on that one, did I? Hey. See, I'm not too bad a teacher, right? Secondly, ask good questions. I already talked about this earlier, but as you listen to their position or their understanding of the strengths of evolution and why Christianity's kind of made up, then you can ask questions rather than launching into a long lecture about these building blocks, if you can, that I've talked about, or punching up this section of the class on them to watch on YouTube. You just ask a good question like, where did the vast amount of the raw stuff come from in the first place? Like, how did the first life begin? Like, how do we explain the specified complexity of DNA in one cell? It's a great idea to ask questions. Those of you who are parents and grandparents, let me say to you, I say this often, but I say it's because it's important. We think sometimes our role in parenting and grandparenting our kids is to lecture, to talk to our beloved sons and daughters. But I really think helping them to process information, helping them to confront and answer the right questions is the best way to go about it. So my parenting tip, especially as kids get into the teenage years, is to ask good questions, to become a great questioner and let there be a conversational flow instead of, well, you sit down and listen to me for 20 minutes. And that 20 minutes, they may listen to you about a minute, if you're lucky, right? Ask good questions. Third, I wholeheartedly believe, and I hope I've convinced you and given you some evidence tonight, that science and Christianity are compatible. And I can tell you for sure that many Christians are scientists and vice versa. I have known, thankfully, quite a few. And I've known others that originally were staunch evolutionists that were very much anti-God, anti-supernatural, that have, as they started dealing with some of the questions we've talked about tonight, then it began to tilt the evidence the other way, and have become solid believing Christians with solid believing families. So they are not incompatible. Fourth, be gracious in second order theological discussions, both when we're talking about differing views of creationism, but in all kinds of questions. I really think sometimes we want to convince people that we're right, and in doing so, we lose any potential influence and impact we have on them. I'll tell you another example of this that I see all the time. I've seen all the time through the years. I was a young preacher, and this guy in my church, well-meaning, but he had a strong eschatological view. By that I mean the end times. He was let's see if I can remember, a pre-trib, mid-something. I mean, he had it defined in like 5 labels of what his view was, and you had to be one of those in viewing the end times, or you were sketchy. And I can't remember. I guess I passed the test because he didn't leave the church. But I'm telling you, what you believe about the end times is not going to be a matter of salvation. It's simply not a first order question. It's a second order question. And so what you're doing here, as you're talking to someone who is a strong evolutionist, has been influenced by evolutionary theory, you want to remember why you're talking to them, and you want to remember that your goal is not to have them believe a certain dogmatic view of creation. It is to believe in the Creator. It's to believe in the Son of the one who created it all. Be gracious. And remember, the mission is winning people to Christ. It's not winning arguments. It's winning people to Christ, not winning arguments. I know, because I'm in this apologetic bent. I like to discuss these things with folks, and thankfully I've helped a lot of folks come to Christ through the years. I know, though, that kind of mindset, to be interested in that kind of stuff, you like to argue. You're competitive. But the win is not winning intellectually an argument. We want to help these people be able to eradicate barriers, hurdles that keep them from faith, that keep them from believing. And to do that, we have to be gracious. I think we have to keep our mission in mind. And to close, I want to talk about just a minute Romans chapter 14. I started with Romans chapter 1 a little earlier, and you write this down again. I didn't put it in the notes. I hope you got down that reference, Romans 1, 18 to 23. But Romans chapter 14. I'm not going to talk about all the chapter. I'm just going to say to you, I think it really has bearing when we're talking about the kind of discussions you would have with someone that's anti-Christianity, pro-science. This is what it says. Accept him whose faith is weak, without passing judgment on disputable matters. One man's faith allows him to eat everything, but another man whose faith is weak eats only vegetables. He's vegetarian. The man who eats everything must not look down on him who does. I got to tell you, it's funny. I got a niece that it's like every other 6 months she's vegetarian. And like if you're not vegetarian, you are evil. But then you'll go out to eat with her, 3 months, 6 months later, and she'll order a steak, and you're like, oh, I'm not vegan anymore. And then 6 months later, she'll be vegan again. Depends on the day. People have different opinions about second order things. He doesn't put it in this language, but this is what Paul's talking about. First order, second order theological discussions. The man who eats everything must not look down on him who does not, and the man who does not eat everything must not condemn the man who does, for God has accepted him. Who are you to judge someone else's servant? To his own master he stands or falls, and he will stand, for the Lord is able to make him stand. One man considers one day more sacred than another. Another man considers every day alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his or her own mind. Each one should be fully convinced in his or her own mind. I commend you and want you to study the different views of creation and have a conviction. But don't make your conviction necessary for everybody else. And I think you'll be a lot more effective in bringing people to belief in the first order matters. That it's about our relationship with Christ that determines everything. He who regards one day as special does so to the Lord. He who eats meat eats to the Lord, for he gives thanks to God. And he who abstains does so to the Lord and gives thanks to God. For none of us lives to himself alone, and none of us dies to himself alone. If we live to the Lord. And if we die to the Lord. So whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. For this very reason, Christ died and returned to life so that he might be the Lord of both the dead and the living. And then this is very important. He says, why then do you judge your brother? Or why do you look down on your brother? For we will all stand before God's judgment seat. It is written, as surely as I live, says the Lord, every knee will bow before me. Every tongue will confess to God. So then, each of us will give an account of himself to God. The mindset I approach, and I have a lot of these discussions, any young person that wants to argue about evolution or whatever with me, is I try to reason with them by love and passion and conviction, but I don't judge them. It's not my role to judge. All I can do is be an advocate, be a witness of these things that God has taught me. That's all you can do as well. You're responsible for your explanation of these different topics and what you believe. The response is on the other person. But the more graciously and lovingly you have those conversations, I think the better they will be received, the better the chance that there's a positive response. And sometimes the response takes years and years later. Sometimes your role is just to plant seeds right now for them only to come up later. So with that said, hope you've enjoyed tonight. I said this last week, I think, or 2 weeks ago. It's not going to be as deep next week. I really think it won't be as deep next week. Okay, I'm trying not to lose you or lose myself. So together we'll muddle through. Okay, I got a minute. So are there any questions? Anybody miss any blanks? Did that format work a lot better? You able to keep up? Okay, thanks for the suggestions. A couple people emailed me and asked me about doing that. And I just got to get it to Shannon in time to prepare it. She did a great job preparing those today. Thankfully, my voice held out. Praise God. Now, I got to be quiet till Saturday. Not going to happen. Not when Josh Tiller lives in your house. Boy talks all the time. I wish I could charge him by the dollar for every word. I was telling Beth, y'all seen those commercials about the easy button? I think it was Office Depot or whatever. I said, we need a quiet button. If we could push it and just for 5 minutes, Josh could be quiet. It would be so awesome. But it doesn't work that way. So great to see y'all. Good turnout tonight. There's still time to invite others. Next week, we're talking about why you can trust the Bible, how the Bible came together, how it's formed, how it's completely trustworthy, that you can have some ways to talk about that with others. People like to say the Bible's just much a mess or just made up or whatever. This will give you ways to talk about that with them. Okay? Awesome. Y'all have a great night. We'll see you.